Yeah.
Welcome to the launch of And Other Essays by Michael Cohen. 18th of October, 2020, your time, 19th of October, our time. Hosted
How is
by,
life in the future?
that's right. The future is now. Hosted by Dr. David Reiter, publisher, Interactive Publications, Pty Ltd, Brisbane, Australia. And you'll see our URL down there. So I invite you all to have a look, ipause.biz. And that's a good place to start if you want to know more about interactive publications. Okay, welcome. IP Interactive Publications Pty Ltd is an independent publisher based in Brisbane, founded in 1997. We publish under 4 imprints: Interactive Press, Glasshouse Books, which is the imprint under which Michael's book is published, IP Kids, and the Digital Publishing Center. Glasshouse Books publishes its prose titles in print and digital formats and distributes them globally through partners such as Ingram International, Amazon, Google, Apple, Overdrive, Wheelers, and Gazelle UK, who distribute in Europe as well as in the United Kingdom. So there's our glorious cover. And I think Daniel gets the credit for the photograph. And you'll notice at the bottom, there is a URL, which is the direct buy now link for the book. So if you want to copy that down, it'll be there for a while. If you have any problems, just go to our homepage, click on IP Store, and you can go to the link from there. Okay, so we're going to have the bio for... Can we have a mute there, please? Thank you. Okay. For the last couple of decades, Michael Cohen has been publishing personal and topical essays in a variety of magazines, from the Harvard Review to Birding. IP published a collection of them, A Place to Read, in 2014. Here is another collection, And Other Essays. Before he retired from teaching, Cohen wrote an introductory poetry text, the poem in question, Harcourt Brace, 1983, and an award-winning Shakespeare study, Hamlet in My Mind's Eye, from Georgia, 1989. Michael Cohen lives in Lincoln, Nebraska, and in the Tucson Mountains, which sounds very interesting. And there's your link again at the bottom of the page. Our launcher is an American living in Australia for 20 years. Lauren Elise Daniels launched her career in 1987 with first prize in Rhode Island's Newport Poetry Contest. Her novel, Serpent's Wake, A Tale for the Bitten, was published in 2018, followed by her 2020 book on writing short stories. She holds a bachelor's and master's in creative writing and has published personal essays in the US, Canada, and Australia. A senior prose editor, Lauren has edited over 90 fiction and nonfiction titles. She is a writing teacher, speaker, and literary judge, and directs the Brisbane Writers' Workshop. So take it away, Lauren.
Thank you, David. Thank you for asking me to introduce your collection. It's a pleasure. And thank you all for joining here today. It's an honor to introduce Michael's new collection, And Other Essays, a bookish sort of book, as he calls it, distilled from almost 8 decades of experience. Truly, it spans further if we trace these contours and ideas all the way back to Gilgamesh, who's mentioned in the essays. And in that spirit, let's go back before we go forward. In 2014, I was one of the selecting editors for A Place to Read, this beautiful collection of essays. It's historically sweeping and geographically spacious. It's his first essay collection, which reveals a deep love for books, and also made clear that this writer is expanded by his experience as a pilot. Those generous views from the air become a gift for his readers. In his new collection, And Other Essays, he writes, "The kid who liked to fly turned into the man who loves to fly." And with these essays, his passion to make connections throughout the world, he takes us right along with him. This year, the essay has surged during COVID-19 across anthologies, literary magazines, audiobooks. Michael's in the process of recording both of his collections into audio, slated for global release, to meet this appetite. As the essay experiences a boom, Michael and David's timing for this collection is perfect. What better than to read personal reflections that reach into the expanse right now, at a time when we might feel small and isolated, and yet so connected to one another. Michael is the master of the essay, and yet his observations are accessible to everyone. His writing feeds the soul as well as the mind and returns us to the joy of reclaiming ourselves, especially in a world that feels so divided and disjointed. Through his writing, we even reconnect with the joy of flight, maybe something we took for granted before COVID. As he writes, it's a method of travel still astonishing and as different from ordinary modes of getting across lands and sea as the soaring of an eagle is from the crawling of an ant. Of course, in this collection, there is travel writing, from the clear blue Arizona sky across the US and into Europe. And this traveler invites contemplation in not so much where we go, but even more what it means. We explore savory science, where travel becomes time travel, as descriptions of Paris meals eaten in the 30s can still evoke the musty, pungent aroma of truffles. I admit, I linger in the travel writing and the savory science. As Michael calls us homeward to the US, we fly to New Orleans, to Brennan's for eggs Hussard. I'll have a mint julep, please. And we're whisked off again for pounds of heaped, steaming crayfish at the center of a newspaper-covered table with bowls of red beans and rice. The pilot takes us again into experiences that make us, despite everything, glad to be alive. Full-bellied, we lift off again. Light as air at times, these essays are unafraid of the darker spaces, where our greatest fears may be housed, where Thomas Jefferson himself observed climate change in deforestation and agriculture, and we are reminded it's in the threads of the past that we see the fabric of the present we have made. And the great suffering at present is somehow quelled by the knowledge that the world has endured before and will do so again. Michael takes us into suffering in a way that we can handle, with a gentle weaving of truth and experience through writers who willfully wrestle with grief and loss in their work. He cites Andre Dubus II, one of America's finest short story writers of the 20th century, whose son was my mentor at Emerson College in Boston. Michael reminds us to keep reading Joan Didion and C.S. Lewis and dear Dr. Sherwin Nuland. With so much death in 2020, remote funerals, absent friends and family, our losses draw us back toward life once again. And Michael writes, Gilgamesh experiences a profound fear of his own death following that of his friend. He goes on a quest for eternal life. After a number of adventures, the futility of the quest finally gets through to him, and he returns to the city of Uruk, whose walls he built himself. And in the words of one of his translators, Nancy Sandars, he engraved on a stone the whole story. Grief, thoughts of one's own mortality, and a stab at immortality for ourselves, our dead friends, and our friendship, sing the song, build the city, preserve the story in stone, write the essay. And ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to welcome and introduce Michael Cohen and his collection and other essays.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for those very kind, very generous words. And speaking of Lauren's words, you should all read Serpent's Wake, her novel. It's a rattling good yarn. It's an adventure story. It's a coming of age story. It's a young woman's self-empowerment story, and well worth reading. I want to read an essay for you, and it was the last one written for this book. It's called The Canyon, The Collision, and the Kid Who Liked to Fly. When I was 13 and about to enter the 8th grade in a small town outside Phoenix, 2 airliners collided over the Grand Canyon, 200 miles to the north. United Flight 718 was a Douglas DC-7 that had taken off from Los Angeles International an hour and a half earlier. Its 58 souls, as the number of passengers and crew are still called on flight plans and in emergencies and accidents. Its 58 souls were on their way to Chicago. Trans World Airlines Flight 2 had also left Los Angeles within minutes of the DC-7's departure and was on its way to Kansas City with 64 passengers and 6 crew members. All told, 128 souls met in the sky on that last day of June 1956 at about 10:30 in the morning. Flight 2 was one of the signature TWA airplanes, the Lockheed Constellation, with its dolphin-shaped fuselage and its 3 separate vertical stabilizers. Fuselage and tail were painted white with red stripes. I'd always wanted to fly in one of those constellations. I'd constructed models of it, as well as of the DC-7, but the Connie was always the sexiest airplane of the 4-engine prop-driven liners. I never got to fly in one. The last one was built in 1958, and all were taken out of service soon after, as jets made such airplanes obsolete. The news that night reported the crash. There was no film. Over the next days and weeks, though, there was film each night on national news briefly and local news longer of the crews that retrieved bodies from the crash. The main parts of the fuselages of both airplanes had come to rest on steep slopes of the canyon. No roads passed near the crash sites, and the retrieval effort was arduous, involving some helicopters, but mostly difficult climbing. Most of the images were either long shots showing the toilers on the slopes as tiny figures among crumpled pieces of the airplanes, or closer shots of body bags being loaded onto vans. My first time seeing body bags was shocking, and a preview of the ones we saw night after night a decade later on the evening news. The dreams provoked by those later images during the Vietnam War were not of soldiers and shooting. They were dreams of airplanes smashing into one another and into hillsides. Because I'd seen the Grand Canyon as a tourist, the TV image of its slopes, where the people in the wreckage were dwarfed by the vast landscape, was a jarring retrospective. It was an astonishing view of the Grand Canyon. When I visited the canyon as a tourist, I'd looked at it from the spots others had decided were spectacular overlooks. This time, I was experiencing what Walker Percy called the recovery of sovereignty through disaster. Percy's essay, The Loss of the Creature, talks about the difficulty we have in directly perceiving a work of art or an object in the natural world. Instead of seeing the Grand Canyon, his main example, we look at it through our expectations of it and compare it to them. Does it look like the postcard? Are the colors as rich as those in the Arizona highways photographs? Does it live up to Aunt Maud's description? Instead of seeing it for ourselves as sovereign perceivers, we've given up our sovereignty to those who've packaged the experience for us beforehand. Percy says we'll never recover the awe and surprise of the canyon's first discoverers, but we can try various ways of seeing it for ourselves. We can get off the beaten track, see it from an angle other than the ones provided by the railed outlooks. with our captive telescopes. Or we can stand behind a young child and try to experience the canyon through her surprise and delight. If we happen to be staying at the canyon when a quarantine kept other visitors away, we might be able to have the canyon to ourselves and see it as something other than a tourist magnet. Percy also imagined seeing the canyon in the midst of some great disaster, which would change our view and banish some of those prepackaged expectations. The Loss of the Creature was published just 2 years after the mid-air collision of the Grand Canyon. But I doubt that Percy remembered that particular disaster if he was ever aware of it. But it was happening to me now in June of 1956. I was seeing just what it meant that the canyon sides fell away thousands of feet to the river below and were so sheer there was no place to drive a Jeep or even a small spot level enough to land a helicopter. The term rugged gets casually applied to this awe-inspiring landscape. What it means is that the canyon is rugged or difficult for people. On the TV picture, the small figures moved slowly with such care that they looked impaired or disabled in some way. They were overwhelmed trying to move and work at an unnatural angle. The camera was filming from far away, perhaps from a helicopter or the top of an adjacent slope. And when the camera operator reversed the zoomed lens, drawing us away from the scene and showing more of the canyon, the workers in the wreckage diminished almost to invisibility. These longer shots were brief, as if the TV editors feared that showing the beauty of the canyon was somehow improper, given the tragic scene barely visible on the distant slopes. Of course, it was not only the canyon that I saw at once in an unmediated way. I saw also that my fellow humans were finally whole or in parts, reducible to just the contents of body bags. You might be reading Plato in your cramped airplane seat, but then suddenly you could be not a consciousness, but bone and brain matter and blood, first in the air and then on the slopes of the canyon. And when I say my fellow humans and you, of course I mean me. I'm just blood and bone and guts. I had liked to think of me as being my outside, neatly containing and more importantly, concealing all those rude pink organs, white sinew, white bone. The realization I had when watching those body bags was not articulated in this way or any way at the time. The words I eventually put to the moment were not mine. 5 years later, as a freshman in college, I read Joseph Heller's Catch-22 about the experience of men flying bombing missions over Germany, told mostly through the perspective of one bombardier named Yossarian. Late in that novel, Yossarian reveals what he's been calling Snowden's secret. Snowden is one of Yossarian's young crew members, and when he's wounded, Yossarian opens his flak jacket and the boy's insides come tumbling out. The secret revealed to Yossarian was the one revealed to me by those searchers on the canyon hillsides, retrieving parts or whole bodies and filling body bags with them. The secret was that we're just this, just meat and blood and entrails. Yossarian, uncovering the shock of my moment by the shock of his, gave me words for what I had been watching during those days following the Grand Canyon collision. I don't believe that when a writer like Percy or Heller gives us words for what we have felt, that they are somehow mediating the experience or getting between it and us. Indeed, they remove something that's between us and the experience, namely its lack of articulation. They fulfill age-old functions of art in giving expression to what we have felt but could not articulate. I never got to fly in a Lockheed Constellation. The wonder is, I suppose, is that I still wanted to after watching the results of once colliding with a DC-7. Although I did not actually see that collision, I spent a lot of time imagining it, and I can see it still in my mind's eye. The simple message that airplanes can collide, that airplanes can crash, was brought home to me. The Federal Aviation Agency was created partly as a result of that canyon collision, and radar coverage was eventually extended over virtually all of the United States, so that now air traffic controllers can see and can separate airplanes, including all airliners and military planes that are in contact with them. Collisions between commercial airliners are very rare in the United States now. They sometimes run into each other on the ground. Although mid-air collisions continue to occur among military planes and among private airplanes. My stepfather owned a private airplane at the time of the canyon crash, and later that year we flew over the Grand Canyon. In a slight detour on our way from Phoenix's Sky Harbor Airport, where the plane was kept, to Las Vegas. The only trepidation I remember from that flight came from my stepfather saying we couldn't fly into the canyon or near the rims, but had to stay high because there were often downdrafts. The necessary altitude made for even more panoramic views. This again was a new and spectacular way of seeing the Grand Canyon from the ample windows of our Cessna 175. Far inferior is the view from the tiny windows of an airliner that's usually traversing the canyon at 30,000 feet, 4 miles above the canyon's rim. Nor do I remember any fear when the next year we took our longest trip yet in the Cessna 175, flying east to overnight in Texas, spending a few days in New Orleans, overnighting again in Fort Lauderdale, and then flying the 150 miles over the ocean to Nassau for a week's stay there. I liked flying in the 175, occasionally in the right or co-pilot seat, taking the controls for short periods under my stepdad's careful monitoring, trying to keep a straight course and maintain altitude at the same time. Even the back seat had its pleasures, especially since I didn't have to share it with anyone. But I might have known even then that the knowledge that airplanes can collide like that would affect me in some way eventually. The kid who liked to fly turned into the man who loves to fly. I racked up lots of frequent flyer miles during my working life as a teacher, jetting off to conferences half a dozen or more times a year, as well as flying to reunite with family and take vacations. And then when our boys were through college and the house paid off, I started to take flying lessons. As a private pilot, I've logged more than 1,300 hours so far. My affection for flying has turned into love, but the fearlessness I had at 13 is no longer there. I have learned how many more things than mid-air collisions can go wrong with a flight, and I felt the responsibility of avoiding those things when I was flying a plane myself. As a passenger in an airliner, I'm free of the responsibility, but even then I feel a little fear mixed with the exhilaration at every takeoff, every landing. Mariana Gosnell writes about the combination of dread and desire she feels about flying. She flew her little 2-seater airplane across the country and back, including a flight over the Grand Canyon, and wrote about it in 03 Bravo, Solo Across America in a Small Plane. My flying is never without a dash of fear. An airplane, like a shark, has to keep moving through its element in order to survive. I cannot pull off the road and coast to a stop to fix something that goes wrong. Danger is part of the game. And pilots speak of careful planning and best flying practices as risk management. I do not believe that most pilots like flying because of the risk. That may be true for some, but not for me. I like flying in spite of the risk and endeavor to make it as small as possible. The Lockheed Constellation first entered service as a military airplane in January 1943, 3 months before I was born. I still haven't given up hope of flying on one. There are two of them still flying, one in Switzerland and the other in Australia. Maybe I'll get a chance to ride in a Connie, but it's probably too much to hope that they'll let me sit in the right seat and take the controls for a while. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And maybe you can get that lift over to Australia in one of those planes to do a tour someday.
That'd be nice.
Okay, everyone. We have a few minutes left for Q&A or comments or praises for Michael. So just make sure that you unmute your microphone before you pitch in and take it away.
Dr. Cohen?
Yes.
You flew a little bit before when you were younger, isn't that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You mean flew myself? No.
Yeah.
But
Oh, okay.
I didn't actually take my first lesson until 2004, I think.
What really strikes me about this is you're talking about the going up in the Cessna and the view being different. Because when I went up with you in your plane, it was astonishingly different because you could see everything.
The whole panorama. Yeah.
And it was terrifying. But then, because I'm not a great flyer anyway, but then you let me take the controls for a few minutes, and any fear that I had vanished the instant that I took the controls, which I thought was very, very interesting.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's like that in a boat too. You feel a little queasy, and you give the person the helm, and that who's having trouble, and it goes away pretty quickly while I concentrate on steering. By the way, Mariana Gosnell's plane was a Luscombe and a two-seater, and that's the plane that my stepdad learned to fly in. And it was the first plane of that size, I think, that I had been in. And he took me up as soon as he got his license. It was the first little two-seater that I'd flown in, and the first time that I'd experienced a deliberate spin. He said, "Do you want to? Anything you want to do? And do you want to spin?" And I said, "Sure." And
Do I?
and then there was the ground turning like that suddenly, in those, as you say, they're big windows. And I must have been gripping things white knuckled. And he said, "You okay? Isn't that what you expected?" Not exactly. Not exactly. I thought it was sort of like a slow spiral or something, not straight down, things going around. Yeah. But it's fun.
Yeah.
It's fun if you know how to get out of it.
Okay, anyone else want to add a comment?
Dave Mayo, unmute your mic.
I just like to say that Lauren said something about Michael having most of 8 decades under his belt. For at least 6 of those, I've known him. I first met him when we were juniors in high school, and I've known him on and off ever since then. I would like to shatter one of his myths, and I have flown in a Lockheed Constellation a number of times. That was in Navy livery with a large radome on top, was an EC-121 in those days. And I wouldn't buy a ticket on one of those sons of bitches now. Had a lot of miles on it. Fortunately, they replaced them with P3s. But I would like to mention that a lot of Michael's essays in this book, and I've read the book, oddly enough, mention Arizona. And I grew up in Arizona with Mike. And it was a lot of mental way back for that. His descriptions of the things you see and do in Arizona are absolutely spot on and tremendous. I shan't comment further on the book because based on the looks of this, he could at least sell 5 copies of it. So I won't delude anybody, but thank you for inviting me to this, and I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Dave. There will be a larger audience. I think, as David will tell you, this is being filmed, and it'll be a YouTube presentation.
That's right. We will send out notifications here, there, and everywhere, and hopefully a much wider global audience will tune in at their leisure, because it'll be streaming whenever people want to tune in.
Dave pointed out one of the gaps in the book that I regret. In the essay, A Chance Conversation, I talk about Stephen Jay Gould and his book, Wonderful Life, about the amazing little creatures, Precambrian creatures that were found in the Burgess Shale in the Rockies. And I said it was the Colorado Rockies. Of course, it was in Canada. Dave was born in Kamloops, British Columbia, so he picked up on that one right away.
Well, small world, because I taught for 10 years in Kamloops.
Did you really? Wow.
Great.
I was chair of the English department for a record short term because I was going to get out of Kamloops and move to Vancouver. But I'm afraid we are out of time. So thank you everyone for tuning in. It was a wonderful reading and great to have everyone here. And I hope you'll visit IP and spread the word about Michael's book far and wide. Thank you very much.